Welcome to the Make the Movie Already podcast. This podcast is for you otherwise busy creatives who can't seem to find the time to finish or start your passion projects. So join me on this journey, however long it takes, to getting our projects done. This is your host, Maria Rios, your friendly, frustrated filmmaker, and welcome to episode 6 of the Make the Movie Already podcast. Today we're going to talk about keeping the joy in your creative practice. And before we get started in earnest, I'd like to take a minute to give Jane a shout out. I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the comment that you left on the YouTube channel, the Make the Movie Already YouTube channel. So I really needed that, and I hope I can continue giving you a boost by working on this podcast. So thank you. All right. So today we're going to keep the joy in our creative practice. Most of this will be rooted in me sharing my story or my personal experiences with this, because this actually is harder for me to talk about than I realized. And I think you'll see why fairly immediately once I get to it. And once we're done with the topic of joy and keeping the joy in our creative processes there, I'll talk a little bit more about where I am on my own film project, and then we'll close. So today could be maybe a shorter episode than usual, or maybe not. I'm not sure about that, because all I know at this time is I'm feeling a little bit of resistance to even talking about this. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll just jump right in by saying that over the course of my lifetime, I've come to associate creative practice with misery and failure. So, yes, creativity equals or equaled or has equaled misery and failure in my life. And so I'll share 3 examples. Music school, art history thesis, and creative writing. So let's start with music school. I started my college life as a music student, actually. And I was a music education major. What made that difficult is that I came into a college program underprepared. So, oh my God, just even thinking about it now, I spent 3.5 years trying to compensate for years of the education and practice that I needed to be successful as a music student. My eye is twitching right now as we speak. Oh my God. So you're going to hear lots of pauses and hemming and hawing, and because I don't really want to talk about it. Because this really was one of the most painful experiences of my life, and it took years to get over. It took years to get over that feeling of failure. Like, my identity was wrapped up in, getting this music degree, and all of this was in my head, and it was hard for me to admit that at the end of the day, I just hated being a music major. Like, I hated the discipline of it. I hated being trapped in a practice room. I hated practicing the same 3 bars for hours and hours to build the muscle memory, to get the notes right. I was a violin major, which made things even more difficult. I had no business being a music major. I had no business doing that. But even going in to college, I had my heart set on it. And unfortunately for me, I had just enough skills to be able to qualify to continue the study. I was accepted. I was accepted into the program, and I mean, it was just a struggle from day one. And to illustrate, like, I didn't know all my scales. There was a huge knowledge gap. And so that challenge was insurmountable. But as I've already mentioned, I discovered in college that the being in the practice room was torture. I was just ill-suited to it. I was ill-suited to it. But I was smart. I was stubborn. How should I say this? I knew just enough to keep passing with high enough grades, even on the performance side of things, although there were some pieces that obviously would be outside of my reach in the time that I had to really be able to learn them. First example is the second violin part of the Marriage of Figaro opera. Geez, if you don't know all your skills and you're not up to par on technique, oh man, that's like running a marathon, straight from the couch. The stress of it, because, I was high achieving, actually. I was academically high achieving going into college. And, with the exception of the, music, I don't know how I managed to pull this off. Still, to this day, because I don't even remember how I sounded. All I remember is the stress. And I was so stressed that I started developing physical symptoms. I had trouble digesting food. I was tired. I had just pain, usually had abdominal pain. I mean, it was, oh my gosh. I had a series of tests done to try and figure out what was going on, and nothing really, kind of panned out. So I spent, 3 years not being able to eat. I ended up getting really depressed about this. I have a natural tendency towards anxiety. And so, you can imagine this was just not, my ideal situation. And I don't know how nobody intervened, through all of this misery, not my coaches, not anyone around me, sat me down and tried to get me to stop. So I had to let this kind of run its course and make the realization that I really needed to let this, I guess part of my identity is one of the major reasons it was so painful to let this go. I had so much expectation wrapped up into this that I just couldn't make the right decision for too long of a time. But I eventually did. I changed my major and was a much happier person after that. But I spent scholarship money torturing myself. I got this resulted in getting into debt because of how I was torturing myself. I was young and obviously didn't have the judgment to be able to make the right decisions for my own well-being in this case. But bottom line, as it pertains to this podcast, it was creativity, music, artistic practice equals misery and failure. But this whole experience left such a deep mark. Like it was so hard to get over that failure. All right, I'm still alive. But so now you get it. That was a very affecting part of my life. And it's a wonder that I'm any kind of creative. Now it was just such a powerful experience. Now, moving forward in my life, I did transition to a major involving the arts. So I started off as a music major, but ended up being a Spanish and art history major with the goal of being a museum curator. That's, I think, seemed like a worthy endeavor, but lo and behold, I had some difficulty with writing. By the time I was ready to graduate, it had taken 2 years of additional coursework to be able to leave with a degree because obviously music had been so specialized. And so frankly, by the end of that, I was pretty burned out. The writing of this thesis wasn't as miserable as what I was feeling as a musician, but I was blocked. Like I was tired. I was burned out. I was blocked. I just couldn't get past my outline. My outline kept shifting. I was afraid to get help. It was just a mess. It was a mess, but I survived, despite the fact that I kind of crashed and burned on that project. And again, that kind of left me feeling like a failure, like I couldn't get over the fact that I didn't do so well on that project, even after having graduated from college, in fact, with honors. I was a double major, and I in Spanish and art history, as I mentioned, and I did exceedingly well in Spanish, and I hit the mark there with whatever writing that needed to happen. But then I graduated, moved on to the work world, and always had this affinity for writing. And so I decided to take like creative writing classes and join writing groups, and I ended up with a lot of unfinished projects and kind of reinforcing a negative feeling with these creative projects. It's like we'll talk about that later, like why I think this was happening. I'm just kind of trying to recall the misery of it. And I think with writing in particular is not being able to complete the thought, the piece, the work, whatever it was, feeling like I was constantly blocked and then not finishing. And here we go. I have an unfinished music school degree. I have an art history thesis in which I crashed and burned. And then now I'm writing creatively and I'm not getting the success that I want. And it's just kind of adding to the list. And those were kind of my significant experiences as a creative person for many years. I mean, that was the basis of it. Oh man, I just think about how bad that felt, the totality of all of that, but how it lingered. I just felt like such a failure for a lot of years of my life based on that. So then, how is it that we're here today talking about, creative practice. How have I managed to become a creative, really, and enjoy it? Because I do. I do. But why would I even want to be creative after all of these experiences? And these experiences, mind you, particularly, being an undergraduate music student and, the art history thesis, these are parts of my life that required a significant amount of time, energy, and resources that seemingly all went to, a burning pile of trash somewhere. But they didn't. They didn't. And what happened, and why I'm here, is number one, I was able to kind of recapture certainty in that being a creative was something that I wanted to do with my life in some way. And it wasn't until I was able to associate it with pleasure as a practice that was positive, that left me feeling good and inspired and productive and joyful, and where this process was actually fun. I knew it was in there somewhere. I just had to remember it because, even before my undergraduate life, I had always had an interest in the arts. I just, didn't know which one would be most interesting to me, most gratifying to me, most pleasurable. I didn't, that was something I had yet to learn. But as a child, the creative expression did exist for me as a pleasurable experience. It was an outlet. It was a place where I could experiment. It's not necessarily something that I exercised a lot of discipline with, which in thinking about it now, I don't know how on earth, again, I ended up, as an undergraduate music student. But bottom line, I always knew I had a heart for it. I just had to find my way back to it. So I eventually ended up in graduate school, and my graduate degree is in radio, television, film at the University of Texas, or from the University of Texas. Usually that means film school, but I was on the Master of Arts side, not the production side. So my studies were rooted in critical cultural studies and more sociology. That's more suited to me. Along the way, I learned who my authentic self could be. I'm still learning who that is. But I did know that I had interest in theories and gearing my education, gearing it towards a more kind of practical enterprise, either academia or advertising, or being able to find a way to combine theory and practice. But there was always kind of a nudge, a curiosity about art in its manifestations. I started to meet film students and I started to appreciate film. And before I graduated, I took a documentary film class and was able to get exposed to video editing and learn a little bit about that. And that piqued my interest. But lo and behold, I didn't turn it into an area of serious academic inquiry. I left it alone. It was supplemental to my degree. I thought this will be the last opportunity I will have really to do this before, I'm doing whatever it is that I'm going to do professionally, and paying off my loans and getting a mortgage and, moving on to a different part of my life. But it just, as I planted the seed, I realized then, that the experiences in filmmaking, documentary filmmaking specifically, it just felt like magic. And it was hard. It was hard for me. And I did feel blocked creatively, like in terms of storytelling. That was the biggest challenge in the courses that I took. And that's kind of natural, I think, considering I was just so new. These were my first class. What am I supposed to expect? I'm learning how to use a camera and do all of this for the first time, and I'm not going to be perfect at it. But it was fascinating to me. It really was. So in my roundabout newbie podcaster sort of way, I've described actually the misery and failure associated with creative practice that has plagued me until recently. And I started to get into what got me to see creativity and creative practice in a more positive light. So I think it might be important to outline what the specific breadcrumbs were that I was able to follow to be able to get to where I am now, where I understand that creativity is part of who I am and what I want to do for the rest of my life. Now, I don't have to necessarily be a professional creative. I should say that straight out, but I want it to be a significant portion of my life. So to be more specific, I was able to, number one, find an art that was pleasurable to me. So that ended up being filmmaking. Since my creative journey involved getting over a negative experience, a significantly negative experience involving creativity, it was important for me to complete a similar activity successfully. So I completed a master's thesis successfully. It was very difficult. It was very anxiety producing. I needed a lot of help to translate what was in my head to paper. It was really challenging for me, but I got through to the other side. And later on, I was able to say, if I finish my thesis, I can do this. If I finish my thesis, I can do that. And there were moments in that process that were really difficult to me, but they didn't transcend to misery or failure. And that's a lot to be said for someone who has perfectionistic tendencies. And, I really had to graduate. And yes, it was a difficult process. Yes, as you might expect, it took a little longer for me to finish my thesis and finish graduate school, but it was a success. And I could say, yes, this is difficult. Yes, writing a thesis is difficult. And it was a lot of really hard work. And that hard work didn't necessarily feel good every time I was doing it. But I was able to get back in there, take my licks, but come out successful. I kept getting back up. And I'm quite proud of that, as I think back on it. And was it a perfect thesis? Absolutely not. I hear that a lot of those aren't, actually. So that thesis and getting introduced to filmmaking and understanding that for me, filmmaking is pleasurable. It was something I was really interested in. And even if I didn't necessarily have a ton of success with it, I just was able to learn about it and just really like it, to the extent that experience with filmmaking just stayed with me. just that introduction stayed with me through the rest of my professional life. And lucky for me, I was able to practice certain aspects of filmmaking as part of my job. And so I enjoyed those projects. And so these things kind of led me to here, where I started to pursue some sort of education, consistent education to become a filmmaker and take on those creative challenges of, learning a creative practice. So after telling you all of this, how exactly do I keep the joy in my creative artistic practice? It's an interesting question for me. Despite what I've already told you, it's a little easier for me to do that than even I would expect. So for one, my artistic practice involves learning, and I'm an enthusiastic lifelong learner. I really am. That's something that really excites me. Now, I don't necessarily want to be in classes forever. These classes have been opportunities to meet people, to experiment. They've been lower stakes classes for me. They provide a way to anchor my schedule, which is helpful for me kind of psychologically, but also, to be able to, kind of set limits between the different facets of my life and make sure that I always have a space carved out. And since filmmaking is so complicated, it really is to my advantage, wherever possible to kind of take courses as they are relevant to me. Sometimes they're not, but it's been a haven for me to have that opportunity. Another thing is searching for community. So one thing I appreciate about learning, getting back to that, for the sake of example, is that it provides an opportunity to learn with other people. I am not the best at learning from the manual. That's the least fun way to learn for me. YouTube University, actually, I am more friendly to now. But keeping that mix of learning and individual learning kind of balanced out to where I'm learning with people, however that could be, is a pleasurable experience and one that yields positive result. Yes, human interaction. I'm all for that. As I podcast. I think one of the most important things that I've learned a little bit later in life is the art of play. Play is the opposite of work. How I learned to equate creativity with misery and failure. Well, for the sake of brevity, I turned music school into work. Music school for me was a way to set myself up for a future profession. There was just so much pressure involved in my own mind that had nothing to do actually with the artistic practice. But bottom line, I turned it into work. I turned it into hard work, and then it was miserable, and it just felt awful, and that yielded nothing for me, or very little. Left me with some scars and it was actually a great learning opportunity, again, in retrospect. But man, it was learning the hard way. So understanding artistic practice as a playful endeavor. Play is directly associated with fun. And the first time I actually heard about this was through my husband's grandmother. So my husband's grandmother learned to paint at age, like in her 80s. And oh man, the lady was amazing. She lived to be 108 years old, and she was spry and intellectual and just lifelong learner, just very inspiring woman. And she became quite an accomplished watercolor painter. And she was painting right up until the end of her life, really, or pretty close to it. And even in spite of some vision loss. So it was very inspirational to have her experience to look up to and to be close to that. And one thing that she mentioned that I thought was really interesting is she talked about her painting practice as kindergarten, that it was important to incorporate that sense of playfulness into her practice. And so she had tons of joy when she painted. I mean, it was always an exploration. There was always a smile on her face. There was always something to share. She was always happy to do it. And it was keeping that sense of play. Specifically that word kindergarten, she would say. You know, we're going to kindergarten. I was just, I miss her. I miss her. I don't know if I mentioned, but she lived to be 108 years old. And I'll never forget having her in my life. Wow. Yeah. But yeah, that was super important for somebody like me. When she talked in that way, I remember how foreign that felt. Like, I'm like, wow, I didn't know you could really think about any practice that way. Like, it was a wake up kind of a phrase. So I am learning to do that. You know, actually, when I start off saying, how cool would it be to do this thing in the editing room? Let me tell you, that is a breakthrough. Because editing for me is one of those tough things that can lead to frustration pretty quick. But and we're talking about video editing specifically. I'm still learning, and sometimes it can get a little tough. But even to say that, yeah, how cool would it be to do this and to actually try it? Without, feeling the pressure of a deadline, or without thinking that this is work. I've actively decided that my projects, the documentary projects that I'm working on, specifically the one about the writer that I talk about all too infrequently, I do not want to associate that with work at all. Like, at all. Based on my own personal history, not going there. So for me, this absolutely has to be fun. I have to find ways to keep the joy, So the learning aspect, kindergarten, those things, for example, those are ways of keeping my practices and my mindset aligned with expectations that are freeing, with building a practice that associates creativity with exploration and as a practice on its own merit. I don't need it to be anything else. If I start to add too much to it, it's not worth it to me to add to the stress. So it's critical, actually, for me to keep the joy. And if it means I may not get something done on my personal deadline, or if I am coming into the project where I can't keep a playful mindset, where I can't stay relaxed, then I give myself the time. All of this really, what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to respect the time that I've already spent doing these documentary projects, time that I've spent learning how to do a podcast. All of this is all related for me. And so out of respect, I want to get these things moving in a positive direction, but a very different direction than I've approached most of the creative projects. Getting back to my meandering newbie podcaster ways, I'm hoping that you find some inspiration that'll help you keep this playful. I've described some difficult experiences in my life, So keeping joy in your practice actually could be much simpler than some of the things that I've done. So if, for example, you like to, have coffee while you write or light a candle. I mean, something as simple as that. If that helps keep the smile on your face, please. I think my experience with this is keeping joy is something that I've really had to work on for one reason or another, and maybe that could be the case for you, and it's important to realize, but it's worth the time and effort to keep the joy. So I'm curious to hear what ways that you keep the joy in your practice, or what ways you could use some ideas in that regard. So maybe this is fodder for more conversation, because it's an important topic. Okay, so that's all I have for keeping the joy in your creative practice. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, I said that I would kind of give you a little bit of a status update on where my film project actually is. And so I'll jump right into it. I'm at a point where I need to set some goals because I am not making as much progress as I want to make. In large part, I think that my overall life is not quite balanced, and so scheduling some of the things that I need to do film-wise has been a little problematic. So how am I going to solve this problem? I have an ongoing list of items that need to happen. I know that my film is going to take the time that I need it to take, based on all of these circumstances, but that I'm going through now. But I have to kind of admit that right now I'm challenged for time. Like, I need to make myself available professionally at my work more. It's like a crunch time. It's like studying for finals. That's the kind of environment that I'm in. And it's seasonal. And so I am relying on this podcast really to kind of keep I'm relying on this podcast to keep myself accountable. But I think I'm reaching the point to where I need to do a little more. So here is what I'm going to do. I am going to write a list, or actually finish writing the list, because the list is never done. And I'm going to pick one thing from it, and I'm going to get that one thing done by the time we have our next conversation, which is next week, Monday. And usually this not usually. This podcast drops at 7:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. So I have from now until then to get something done on my documentary film project. Now, I've got a couple of projects going. I've got a very short that I started this summer, maybe last summer. Gosh, I think actually it's been more than a year since I've been working on this second project. I haven't decided if I'll focus on that second project, because it's kind of a filmmaking practice makes perfect kind of a project. And so I decided to do that to keep my filming alive, and because I'm actually interested in the subject, and it was more experimental than anything else. And so I actually do have something that I could show, that I could consider finished or nearly finished. So either that, or I'll do one thing related to the larger project that has inspired this whole podcast. So, but I think one or the other is good choice. One or the other would be a good choice right now, as long as I do this one thing, because I think one film related item I will have the capacity for in the coming week, because things are indeed getting quite busy. All right. That's where I am with the project. I wish I could say that I had more to share there, but I think that keeping myself open on topic or task, but setting an accountability measure, which is sharing what exactly I got done next week, will give me the option, or will give me a reasonable option towards getting my project done. I'll leave it at that. Okay, so I guess it's time to wrap up. It's really interesting to me that this podcast is likely longer than I intended. I think now is a good time to close. I look so forward to our time again next week. Please put some thought into keeping your creative practices joyful. This is really an important aspect of creative production. So if you don't like it, then why do it, right? So if you like it, you got to love it. And if you love it, then it's, likely bringing you joy. So however you can manufacture that joy, however you can keep that flame alive, it's worth doing. And thank you so much for the ear. I do have socials up. I'm still hard to find because I'm learning to work those algorithms. So if you have time enough to to find me there, I'll say hello. And to everyone, stay creative, stay healthy, stay happy, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.